So we've reached the cognitive turn that happened after the Second World War. We're talking 1950s, 1960s. A process in which the computer metaphor took over completely the way matters to do with perception, minds, and so on are discussed. And in that time, then there arose a new form of psychology, literally a new form of psychology, which we now call cognitive psychology. So remember, psychology is very, very broad. Scientific approaches to psychology are a subset of those, and there are many. And now we have one particular niche area called cognitive psychology. Please don't make the mistake of taking this to stand for psychology as a whole. And in this new field, people worked with the computer metaphor and the notion of information. And this has gained strength and become a very, very powerful way to think about people and their behavior. I'm not sure it says much about experience. And some of its hallmarks are it uses scientific means without unqualified recourse to introspection. And when I say scientific means, notice I didn't say it uses the scientific method. This may come as a shock, but there is no the scientific method. Science is very broad and diverse, has many fields with very different assumptions about the world and how it works, so there is no single scientific method. But there are a variety of scientific means which may be used appropriately or inappropriately. And this uses scientific means, often quantified with experiments. One of the founding assumptions is that mental states are something you can talk about. And typically, this taps into an older, much older way of thinking about minds in Western philosophy, in which the mind of a subject is taught to harbor beliefs, desires, and intentions, the BDI trilogy. Now, we'll see problems with dealing with these, but that's an assumption underlying a lot of cognitive psychology. And nearly all the work there uses some version of what we might call the information processing paradigm. Now, you're all used to this vocabulary. You hear about the brain taking things in and processing information all the time. This is metaphorical talk. It is not literal talk. The information processing paradigm is working with this metaphor that the brain is a bit like computer hardware, thoughts or mind is a bit like computer software. And thinking then along those lines leads you to think of perception as a process of input to some kind of system and the resulting behavior as its output. This is the computational theory of mind. Please do not mistake this for a known fact about the person. It is not universally accepted, nor should it be universally accepted. It is a metaphor and it has severe limits. But we'll see as we go on that an awful lot of work in science is unreflective, that is unaware of its own limitations. And so we'll see that some version of this has become very useful, not just for scientists, but for industrialists and people in power, for the flow of capital. So we won't be uncritical with respect to this. But this arose then only on the back of this computational cognitive turn. And there's been a lot of development since then. So we've had 60 years odd of this kind of theorizing. And as we wrap up this history, we'll just notice some ways in which the landscape has dramatically changed in those last 60 years. We'll be digging into the detail in later lectures in this module, but this will complete our historical overview. So first up, we introduced the dream of artificial intelligence, which was an early pipe dream born of the computational metaphor. And we saw examples of it in solving simple problems and in facilitating interaction with a user through a keyboard and so on. That dream is dead. That view of mind has no plausibility whatsoever anymore. That way of thinking about mind did not scale up. The idea that you could just build a system that had ever more command of the facts, had an ever more secure grasp on a true and perfect knowledge of its world, that is gone. But unfortunately, the term artificial intelligence still remains with us. It means something completely different now. These days, the massive results that are attributed to this so-called artificial intelligence come from what's called machine learning. Machine learning is an engineering procedure in which you obtain data points and fit curves to them. You may have done this in your statistics class. That underlies all of machine learning, and unfortunately the name artificial intelligence has spread to that. Machine learning produces very, very powerful results, ever more spectacular when you see the output of programs like DALL-E or GPT-3, which I'm sure we'll be meeting later on in this course. But the game has changed. This is not the principled exploration of the notion of intelligence or the elaboration of a plausible metaphor of mind. This is a set of engineering practices that are now inappropriately labeled. People have been using drawing on the 20th century's vast progress in mathematics. One thing that's become ever more apparent is that people are willing to use other mathematical formalisms and other metaphors in thinking about minds. Dynamical systems theory, you may know this from the film Jurassic Park, where chaos theory was introduced briefly by Jeff Goldblum. Dynamical systems theory was one of the gems of the last half of the 20th century, and it delivered us a spectacular new array of mathematical tools for thinking about natural processes. Finding widespread application, this is still work in progress. The degree to which they are suited to answering the kinds of questions we might ask in cognitive science is an open question. Another thing that's happened is technological innovation in our ability to make pictures derived from brains. Brain imaging has become enormous, a field in which our technological prowess vastly outstrips our ability to make sense of the images that we produce. We'll address the relationship between neuroscience, cognitive psychology, other approaches later on in this course. But neuroscience is not committed to any one theory of mind. Nevertheless, there are large parts of neuroscience that are developed using something like cognitive psychology as a guiding metaphor. Neuroscience, in other words, investigates brains, and brains are things. Neuroscience doesn't investigate minds. For that, an additional interpretive leap is needed, and we'll meet that in the discipline of cognitive neuroscience. But there's been a lot more since. One point I'll be coming back to repeatedly in this module is the development of a variety of views which get away from the idea of the brain as being the place where experience is generated. You see, nobody's ever made that into a coherent view. The brain, as I said, is a thing in the body. The body as a whole belongs to what we call the organism. And any mind talk might perhaps be more appropriately talked about bodies in their environments rather than brains in their secret skulls. So embodied cognitive science pushes back against the species exceptionalism that would attribute a rational soul to a human animal. It pushes back against neurocentrism, which is the idea that the nervous system is the only part of the body that we need to take account of. There are many flavors of embodied cognitive science, and we'll meet them. It's a widely growing field, but they all challenge the idea of thinking that your mind should be understood with respect primarily to your brain. All that mind talk about knowing, perceiving, thinking, and so on are all activities that involve the whole body and its world, its material world in all its complexity. So this pushes back against the idea that it's all in your head. And so these days we find a strong opposition, as it were, between representational cognitive science, which tends to work with an assumption that we can separate the mental and the physical, which tends to assume that the brain is the right place to look when it comes to minds, and that the brain belongs to a person who operates on the world in the manner in which, supposing you want a Coke from a machine, you go to the machine, you push a button, and a Coke can comes out. In that way, you are the agent, and you made something happen in the world. Now, our understanding of our being in the world is work in progress, let's say. But this model suits representational cognitive science, which tends to look at a strict divide between the person and the world. In embodied cognitive science in all its varieties, the relationship with the world is conceived of differently. It's more like the relationship of one hand to another in a handshake. That is, it's a kind of a dance, a reciprocal dance. There's very many flavors, but what they share in common is that they don't stuff experience into the head. And we'll meet terms like embodiment, inaction, extended mind, the embeddedness of the cognitive agent in its world. And so a wide variety of positions open up. And this little graphic here illustrates some of the points we've touched on so far. So at the top left, we see Cartesian dualism. The red stuff is the mind stuff, which is separate from the body stuff. We saw the behaviorist solution to things, which is just stop talking about minds altogether, get rid of all that red stuff. That's a bit problematic. We've seen the idea that minds are what brains do, and that comes in a variety of flavors. There's identity theory, in which case mind talk and brain talk are just different aspects of the same thing. We'll see in cognitive psychology a variant of that called functionalism, in which, yeah, pretty much the same thing, but you wouldn't expect to understand brain structures in terms of cognitive functions. There you need a bit more distance from the brain in order to interpret it. Or eliminativism, in which case we could just replace mind talk with brain talk, a fairly extreme position. Then there's an interesting point of view provided by Daniel Dennett, the intentional stance, which suggests that all this mind talk, well, minds they don't really exist. What they are ways of understanding other people. So in order to make you comprehensible, I'm going to have to figure out and treat you as if you had some kind of a mind, and then I'm going to have to develop a theory of mind, and so on. And it's all just made up stuff to understand other people. That's the intentional stance. Great fun. Then there's some interesting work in the last 20 odd years on a notion of the extended mind, which really asks, if we say mind is not in the head, and many of us are forced to develop these ideas, what do we mean by that? And it recognizes the increasing role played, for example, by our technologies in supporting our memory and access to the world. So the extended mind has the mind kind of leaking out of the head. And then in the many varieties of embodied cognition, we get a completely different view of mind, in which mind is not in the body or the head, but it lies in the relation between an organism and its world. So that's a indication of just how varied this landscape is. And if that seems less secure a science than you were expecting, I sympathize, but spare a thought for the alchemist. Chemistry is a well-ordered science. We have the periodic table, and we have lots of procedures, and we kind of know what we're doing in chemistry. Cognitive science is not like chemistry. But chemistry didn't appear overnight. Chemistry appeared as a result of centuries, millennia of people interacting with materials, asking really interesting questions about materials, developing intuitions for the ways materials combine, and gradually being able to answer some of the questions they had about substances through what we now call the science of matter. But those people who gave rise to chemistry, they didn't see themselves as chemists. They were alchemists. Alchemy combines this inquisitive approach to matter or substance with a whole host of other questions, philosophical questions, religious questions, occult questions, questions of magic, all kinds of really interesting questions. In some respects, cognitive science is more like alchemy. Yet it'll probably spin off very stable fields, and one could argue it already does, but the questioning that goes on is less than stable because it's questioning about ourselves and our own being in the world. In this respect, we shouldn't expect it to get any less diverse or less boring in the future. I hope you can stick with the confusion as we explore the many varieties of cognitive science as we go on.